Picking up where we left off, in the last video, I want to continue our look at the idea of changing this real long bristle brush variant into a liquid ink brush. Now currently it hasn't been changed yet, so this is the mark that I get with a color of black. Now what I want to do first is I want to come over here to the bristle control panel, and we're going to see that we have a slider here named feature. Now the idea of feature is that if we increase the feature, we decrease the number of brush hairs in this particular brush. And if we decrease the feature, we're going to increase the number of brush hairs in this particular brush. This is a concept that we're going to see again when we go to liquid inks. So what I want to do is I want to change the dab type from camel hair over here to a liquid ink camel hair. Now what this will do is it will allow us to take all of the same properties of the current brush, but we're going to be able to apply them as a liquid ink brush. Now, the first thing you need to understand about liquid ink brushes is that they create their own layer if we're not already working on a liquid ink layer, and I'll come back to that concept in just a second. But first, I want to point out to you a couple of things. When we're dealing with liquid ink brushes, the spacing and the minimum spacing become important again. Now, this spacing that we have here is way too small. So the very first thing I want you to do is just go ahead and increase both these sliders to the maximum values so that we will not have any kind of lag because of the spacing being so small. The second thing that I want to do is I want to go ahead and just make a mark. Now what you're going to see is that we get a very different brush character than what we got before, and you're also going to see that we're working with a liquid ink layer now. Now the reason why we're getting such a different character here is because liquid ink is going to have a couple of unique properties to it. The first is that we're going to be dealing with this concept of volume. And the second is we're going to be dealing with this concept of surface tension. Now, the idea of surface tension is that when droplets meet one another, they're going to coalesce into one droplet. You can think of every single dab as essentially being a single droplet. And when these dabs touch one another, they're going to coalesce into one big blob. The next thing that we want to be aware of is how volume affects that. Well, if we have more volume in a particular blob, then when it meets another blob, it's going to flow into it more readily because there's more volume. But in addition to this, instead of seeing this as just a static sort of high contrast line, we can also visualize the volume in a impasto-esque way. So if I come over here and I double click on my liquid ink layer, what you're going to see is that I have two sliders here. I have threshold and amount. If I increase the amount up, and I'll just go ahead and increase it to say 100% and say okay, what you're going to see is that I get an impasto type look here. And this is something that will become a lot more obvious if I use something like a gray. You can see that I'm getting the volume of this liquid ink brush applied as impasto. So whenever we're working with liquid ink, we're working with the surface tension, but we're also working with this concept of volume. And this is the reason why liquid ink gives us the unique results that it does give us. Now I'm going to come back over here to the liquid ink layer for a second. I'm going to go ahead and set the amount back to 0 so that we get rid of that impasto look. And what I want to do is I want to make a few small changes to this brush so that we get something that's going to be more optimized for liquid ink. The first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to set the boost down to 0. I'm going to come over here to the color variability. I'm going to set the value down to 0. And then what I want to do is I want to come over here to smoothing, and I want to go ahead and set the cubic interpolation points down to 0. And this is going to give us something that's going to work a little bit better for liquid ink. I'm also going to go ahead and switch our color back to black. And then what I want to do is I want to go ahead and collapse the bristles panel. But before I do that, I want to point out to you that I still have my feature set to 1.8 over here. So I'm just going to go ahead and double click that to collapse that. I'm going to go ahead and double click over here on spacing for a second to collapse that. And what I want to do is I want to come down here to liquid ink. So I'm going to go ahead and open that up. And what you're going to see is that we have a number of different types of ink that we can apply. We have ink plus color, ink only, color only, soften ink plus color, soften ink only, soften color only, resist, erase, and pre-softened ink plus color. Now you can play with all these on your own time, but I'm going to go ahead and stick with ink plus color for the rest of these videos. The next thing that we have to consider is the smoothness. The idea of the smoothness is going to be the idea of the surface tension. So the lower the smoothness, the less the surface tension is going to come into play. So we're going to go ahead and set this all the way down to say something like 10 so that we have very little surface tension. The next thing is the overall maximum volume. Now right now the maximum volume is set to 120%. I'm going to go ahead and set this also down to a value of 10, and that's going to go ahead and set my maximum to a very low volume so that I get something that looks more like this. You can see that what I'm getting now is a much more broken brushstroke than what I was getting before. Now what I want to do is I want to go ahead and set the randomness sliders to 0 and 0. And over here under ink droplets, I want to go ahead and set the volume jitter and the size jitter down to 0 and 0 and go ahead and make another mark. And now you're going to see I'm getting a very different character, something that's much closer to what I was getting originally before I switched over to liquid ink. Now, the next thing that I would want to do is I would want to go over here and reduce the thickness down to say something like 25. And you can see now I'm beginning to see those individual brush hairs in a way that makes sense. So the idea here is that you would balance these sliders until you get something that's going to show the brush hairs that you want. But when we're working with liquid ink, we're probably going to want to have a higher feature than that 1.5 that we got by default. So I'm just going to go ahead and set the feature down to say something around 2.8. That looks pretty good to me. And then I'm going to come over here and I'm going to increase the volume a bit to 51 so that we can see something where we're getting more volume, and that's going to cause this to clog up more. So the idea here again is that you would just balance these until you get something that's going to show the hairs in a way that's useful to you. So this is a good starting liquid ink brush. I'm going to go ahead and do a Control-A and backspace to clear all the information off of that liquid ink layer. And I'm just going to come over here and just put these to round numbers. So I'm going to go ahead and set this to 35 for the maximum volume. I'm going to leave this at 25, and I'm going to go ahead and set this to a value of 3. And I'm going to go ahead and make a mark. So this is the mark that we're going to begin the next video with.